Sometimes the people who humiliate you in public are only revealing what they've been hiding in private for years. I still remember the sound my dinner plate made when it shattered across the marble floor of Bellarosa Italian Grill. Conversation stopped. Forks froze in midair. Even the piano player near the wine bar missed a note. And standing across from me in a cream-colored designer dress was my daughter-in-law, Ashley, glaring at me like I was something filthy she wanted erased from her perfect evening. Which, she snapped loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. You should have never come. My 8-year-old granddaughter Emma burst into tears beside her birthday cake. I stood there completely motionless, my hands trembling against the edge of the table while warm marinara sauce slowly dripped onto my shoes. For a second, I honestly thought Ashley might apologize. Maybe stress had gotten to her. Maybe she didn't mean it. But then she crossed her arms and looked directly at Daniel, my son, waiting for him to choose a side. And that was the moment my heart truly broke. Because Daniel looked down at his glass of water and said nothing. Not one word. Around us, strangers stared with that uncomfortable expression people get when they know they're witnessing something deeply personal. A young waitress rushed forward with napkins while an older couple at the next table whispered to each other. I wanted to disappear. I had spent nearly 2 hours getting ready for that dinner. At 68 years old, I no longer moved as quickly as I once did, but I still curled my silver hair carefully and wore the navy blue dress Emma once told me made me look fancy like a movie grandma. I had wrapped her birthday present myself that morning, tying the ribbon 3 separate times until it looked perfect. I wasn't supposed to ruin the evening. I was supposed to be family. Ashley suddenly laughed under her breath and shook her head. I can't believe you actually showed up after what you did. I stared at her, confused. Ashley, I don't understand. Of course you don't, she replied coldly. You always make everything about yourself. Daniel finally looked up, but only long enough to mutter, Mom, maybe tonight just isn't the best night. Not the best night. I felt those words sink into my chest harder than the insult itself. Because I suddenly realized this wasn't impulsive. This wasn't stress. They had talked about this before I ever walked through those restaurant doors. Emma slid out of her chair and grabbed my hand tightly. Grandma, don't go, she whispered through tears. Ashley immediately turned toward her daughter. Emma, sit down. Her sharp tone made the child flinch. I bent down slowly, forcing myself to smile even though my eyes burned with humiliation. It's okay, sweetheart, I whispered softly. Grandma's all right. But I wasn't all right. As I reached for my purse, I noticed people avoiding eye contact with me now, the way strangers do when they pity someone. The manager approached carefully and offered to clean up the mess, but I could barely hear him over the pounding in my ears. The only thing I could focus on was the awful realization that my own son had just watched his wife humiliate his mother in front of an entire restaurant and decided I deserved it. The cold night air hit my face the second I stepped outside the restaurant, but somehow it still felt easier to breathe out there than inside that dining room. My hands shook as I tightened my coat around myself and walked toward the parking lot, trying not to cry until I reached my car. Behind me, I could still hear muffled laughter and clinking glasses through the restaurant windows, as if nothing had happened at all. As if I had not just been humiliated in front of dozens of strangers by the woman my son married. I reached my old silver Buick and stood beside it for a moment, staring at my reflection in the dark glass. My mascara had smudged beneath my eyes, and suddenly I looked every bit of my 68 years. Tired, disposable, alone. Then I heard small footsteps racing behind me. Grandma, Emma's tiny voice cracked through the silence. I turned just in time for her to wrap her little arms around my waist. Please do not leave, she cried softly. I did not even open my present yet. My heart nearly broke all over again. I bent down carefully and brushed the hair away from her face. Sweetheart, your birthday should stay happy, I whispered. Grandma does not want to ruin your special night. You did not ruin it, she said immediately. Mommy was mean. Before I could answer, the restaurant door opened again. Ashley stormed outside wearing that same icy expression, her high heels clicking sharply across the pavement. Emma, she snapped. Get back inside right now. Emma held onto me tighter. Ashley looked embarrassed now, but not guilty. There was a difference. She glanced around nervously to make sure nobody nearby was watching her family scene unfold in the parking lot. Margaret, she said through clenched teeth, you always make things dramatic. I stared at her in disbelief. Dramatic? My voice barely sounded like my own anymore. You threw my dinner onto the floor. She folded her arms. Because you were not invited. That sentence settled into my chest like a stone. Not invited. I looked back toward the restaurant windows where I could see Daniel sitting alone at the table now, staring down at his phone instead of coming outside to stop this disaster. 20 years ago, that same boy used to cry whenever he saw me upset. Now he could not even walk across a parking lot for me. Daniel told me Emma wanted me there, I said quietly. Ashley laughed once under her breath. Emma is a child. She does not make family decisions. Emma's face tightened with confusion and hurt. I could tell she did not understand why the adults she loved suddenly sounded like strangers. I knelt beside her again and handed her the neatly wrapped gift box I had carried all evening. You can open it tomorrow, I said gently. It is the charm bracelet we looked at together last month. Her eyes widened immediately. The butterfly one. I smiled softly despite the ache in my chest. The butterfly one. Ashley exhaled impatiently and reached for Emma's hand. Say goodbye. Emma looked at me one last time before whispering, I love you, Grandma. I watched them walk back toward the restaurant entrance together, the little girl looking over her shoulder at me every few seconds. Ashley never looked back once. And when the door finally closed behind them, I realized something that frightened me more than the humiliation itself. For the first time in my life, I no longer felt like part of my own family. I drove home that night with both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. The streets were almost empty, and every red traffic light seemed to last forever. I kept replaying the scene in my mind over and over again, hearing Ashley's voice, seeing Daniel lower his eyes instead of defending me. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my chest felt so heavy I could barely breathe. My little white house suddenly looked different somehow. Smaller, quieter. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of lavender candles and old wood polish. Normally that smell comforted me. That night it only reminded me how alone I was. I placed my purse carefully on the kitchen counter and noticed the extra tray of homemade lasagna still sitting there under foil. I had spent nearly 4 hours making it from scratch because Daniel used to love my cooking when he was younger. Even after he married Ashley, I kept trying to hold on to those traditions, believing they still mattered to him somewhere deep inside. I slowly removed my earrings and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched tray of food while memories began flooding back faster than I could stop them. I remember Daniel at 19 years old calling me in tears because his college tuition payment was overdue. I emptied nearly half my savings account the next morning without hesitation. Years later, when Ashley and Daniel wanted to buy their first home in the suburbs, the bank rejected them because their credit was not strong enough. I gave them $30,000 from the insurance money my late husband left behind. Ashley cried and hugged me that day. She called me family. I remembered babysitting Emma almost every afternoon for 5 straight years, so Ashley could continue working at the real estate office. I missed doctor appointments, church lunches, even vacations with old friends because I wanted to help my family succeed. Whenever Emma got sick, they called me first. Whenever Daniel felt overwhelmed, he came to me. And every Christmas morning, there I was in their living room before sunrise assembling toys, wrapping forgotten presents, and cooking breakfast while Ashley slept upstairs. I never complained because I truly believed love meant showing up even when nobody noticed your sacrifices. But somewhere along the way, my help had stopped feeling like love to them. It became expectation, obligation, something they believed they deserved automatically. My eyes drifted toward the framed family photograph sitting beside the coffee maker. It was taken 3 years earlier at a beach in Cape Cod. Daniel had his arm around Ashley, and Emma sat on my lap smiling with missing front teeth. We looked happy, normal, safe. I picked up the frame slowly and noticed something painful for the first time. Ashley was not smiling at me in that picture. She was smiling at the camera. Her eyes had always looked cold whenever they landed on me. I just never wanted to admit it. My phone buzzed suddenly against the table, startling me. For one foolish second, I hoped it was Daniel calling to apologize. But instead, it was a text message from Ashley. Emma is upset. Please do not contact her for a few days until things calm down. I stared at the screen for nearly a minute in complete silence. Then another message appeared beneath it. And next time, wait until you are invited. I felt something inside me crack quietly then, not loudly like the plate in the restaurant, but slowly and deeply, the kind of crack that changes the shape of a relationship forever. The next morning, I woke up with the strange feeling that maybe the entire thing had been exaggerated by emotion. Sometimes painful moments feel sharper at night. I stood in my kitchen making coffee while sunlight spilled across the counters, trying to convince myself that Ashley had simply lost her temper. Families argued. People said cruel things when stressed. Maybe if I gave everyone a little time, Daniel would call and explain everything. But by noon, the silence had started feeling intentional. Daniel did not call. Emma did not call. Even the family group chat remained quiet. That was unusual after birthdays because somebody always shared pictures afterward. I tried distracting myself by watering the flowers on my front porch and folding laundry, but my thoughts kept circling back to the restaurant, to Ashley's face, to the way she said I was not invited. Around 3 in the afternoon, my neighbor Carol stopped by unexpectedly with banana bread wrapped in foil. Carol and I had attended the same church for almost 12 years, and she usually visited whenever she sensed something was wrong. The second she stepped inside, her expression shifted awkwardly. "Margaret," she said carefully, "are you all right?" I forced a smile. Of course. Why would I not be? Carol hesitated long enough for my stomach to tighten. Then she sat down slowly at the kitchen table and looked at me with obvious discomfort. "I probably should not say this," she admitted softly, "but I think you deserve to know." A cold feeling crept into my chest. "Know what?" She exhaled quietly. "Ashley has been talking about you for a long time." I stared at her without blinking. "Talking about me how?" Carol looked genuinely uncomfortable now. "At church events mostly. Sometimes during parent fundraisers at Emma's school." She paused before continuing. "She tells people you are controlling, that you interfere in their marriage, that you use money to manipulate Daniel." For several seconds, I could not even process the words. "Manipulate?" I repeated quietly. Carol nodded with regret in her eyes. "She makes it sound like you guilt them constantly, like you expect praise for helping with Emma." I leaned back slowly in my chair, suddenly remembering dozens of small moments over the years that had seemed harmless at the time. The awkward silences when I joined conversations at school events. The strange looks from younger mothers at church luncheons. The way Ashley always corrected my stories in front of other people with a tight little smile. "I honestly thought Daniel knew," Carol said carefully. "Ashley speaks very openly sometimes." My hands felt numb resting against the coffee mug. "Nobody ever told me." "Most people did not want drama," Carol admitted. "And honestly, Ashley can be very charming when she wants to be." That part hurt because it was true. Ashley knew exactly how to present herself in public. She volunteered at charity auctions, organized school bake sales, and posted smiling family pictures online every holiday. Meanwhile, I was simply the aging mother-in-law standing quietly in the background. Suddenly, the restaurant scene made horrifying sense. Ashley had already spent years building a version of me inside other people's minds. By the time she humiliated me publicly, she probably believed everyone would assume I deserved it. Carol reached across the table and touched my hand gently. "For what it is worth," she whispered. I never believed her. I smiled politely, but deep down something inside me had shifted again. Because for the first time, I realized Ashley did not merely dislike me. She had been carefully erasing me for years. 3 days passed without hearing Daniel's voice. By the 4th morning, the silence no longer felt accidental. It felt organized, deliberate. I sat alone on my back patio with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands while spring rain tapped softly against the porch roof. Normally Emma would have called me by then. Every Thursday after school, she used to video chat with me while showing me drawings from art class or complaining about math homework. But my phone remained silent beside me hour after hour. Around noon, I finally decided to text Daniel myself. I kept the message simple because I did not want another argument. "I miss Emma. I would appreciate a chance to talk." He did not answer for nearly 2 hours. When his reply finally appeared, my stomach tightened before I even opened it. "Things are tense right now. Ashley thinks space would be best." I stared at those words for a long time. Not "I think." Ashley thinks. Somewhere along the way, my son had stopped speaking for himself entirely. I typed 3 different responses before deleting all of them. Eventually, I simply put my phone down and tried convincing myself to accept reality with dignity. But later that evening, something happened that changed everything. I was searching for an old recipe on my tablet when a notification suddenly appeared from the family group chat. At first I assumed it was a mistake because the conversation had been quiet for days. But then I realized something strange. The message disappeared almost immediately, as if somebody had accidentally sent it to the wrong thread before removing it. Unfortunately for them, I had already read enough. We cannot keep letting her guilt everyone forever. My chest tightened instantly. Before I could even process the sentence, another message appeared briefly. This one from Ashley. Exactly. Daniel agrees that boundaries are overdue. Then the notifications vanished again. My hand started shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the tablet. For several seconds, I sat frozen in silence while my heartbeat pounded in my ears. They had another conversation without me. A separate family conversation. I suddenly understood what had happened. Somebody had accidentally posted inside the wrong group chat before deleting the messages, which meant there had been discussions about me happening privately for who knew how long. I opened the family chat again slowly, staring at years of photographs, holiday plans, birthday wishes, and smiling emojis. Looking at it now felt almost surreal, like examining evidence from a life that no longer existed. Then my phone rang unexpectedly. It was my younger sister, Linda. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong from the hesitation in her voice. "Margaret," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you do not get upset." My throat tightened. "What is it?" She paused awkwardly. "Ashley called me yesterday." I closed my eyes slowly. "About what?" Linda sounded uncomfortable. "She said the family needs healthier boundaries. She implied you have been emotionally dependent on Daniel since your husband passed away." The humiliation burned hotter this time because it was no longer private. Ashley was spreading a narrative. Carefully, systematically. "Did Daniel know she called you?" I asked quietly. Linda hesitated long enough to answer my question without words. I felt suddenly exhausted in a way that sleep could never fix. For years, I had believed I was helping hold my family together. But now the truth stood painfully clear in front of me. They were not merely pulling away from me. They were building a new version of the family where I no longer belonged inside it at all. The following Sunday, I did something I had not done in years. I stayed home from church. I could not bear the thought of walking into another room wondering which smiling faces had already heard Ashley's version of me. Instead, I sat quietly in my living room with the television off and the curtains half open while rain drifted softly against the windows. For the first time since the restaurant incident, I stopped crying. Not because the pain disappeared, but because something colder had started replacing it. Clarity. I began noticing things I had ignored for years. The stack of unpaid receipts in my kitchen drawer from Emma's school supplies and dance lessons I had covered without question. The monthly automatic transfer I still sent Daniel to help out a little after his promotion supposedly increased his salary. The spare house key hanging near my back door that Ashley once demanded for family emergencies, but used more often to drop Emma off without notice whenever babysitters canceled. Suddenly, my sacrifices no longer looked generous. They looked expected. I walked slowly into my home office and opened the small metal filing cabinet beside my desk. Inside were decades of carefully organized folders labeled in my handwriting. Insurance papers, mortgage records, tax documents, savings accounts, trust paperwork from my late husband, Robert. I had avoided looking through those files since his funeral 6 years earlier because they reminded me too much of the life we built together. But that afternoon, something pushed me to finally sit down and examine everything clearly. Robert had always handled investments himself. He believed in planning quietly and thoroughly. "People behave differently around security," he used to say. "The less they know, the more honestly they treat you." At the time, I thought he sounded overly cautious. Now his words echoed through my mind with painful accuracy. As I reviewed the paperwork, I realized something unsettling. Daniel and Ashley had no idea how much financial support they still indirectly depended on from me. The property taxes for their home? I had quietly covered them twice during difficult years. Emma's private tutoring program? Paid through an education account under my name. Even the luxury SUV Ashley drove had only been possible because I co-signed their loan after Daniel's credit problems 3 years earlier. Yet somehow, in Ashley's version of reality, I was the burden. My phone buzzed suddenly with another text message from Daniel. "Emma keeps asking about you." I stared at the message calmly this time. No apology. No acknowledgement of what happened. Just emotional bait designed to reopen the door without addressing the damage. A few seconds later, another message arrived. Ashley thinks maybe everyone needs time before things get worse. I actually laughed quietly to myself then, though there was no humor in it. Worse for whom? I looked around my peaceful little house and realized something important. The chaos in my life had never started here. It always arrived through them. For years, I had mistaken exhaustion for love. I typed slowly before sending my reply. I agree. Space is probably best right now. Daniel responded almost immediately. You are not upset? I stared at the screen for several seconds before placing the phone face down on the table without answering. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. A pale afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors, warming the room gently. And sitting there in the silence, surrounded by the life I had built with my own hands, I understood something Ashley never expected. The moment a woman stops begging for a place at the table is the moment she becomes impossible to control. 2 weeks passed before Daniel finally showed up at my front door. I had just returned from the grocery store when I saw his black SUV parked beside the curb. For a brief moment, my heart reacted before my mind could stop it. Some part of me still hoped my son had come to apologize. But the second I stepped out of my car and saw the tension in his face, I knew this visit was not about regret. It was about inconvenience. Daniel followed me quietly into the house while I placed grocery bags onto the kitchen counter. He looked tired. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes, and his expensive button-down shirt hung wrinkled at the collar like he had not been sleeping properly. You look thin, I said automatically before I could stop myself. Old habits are difficult to break, especially for mothers. Daniel exhaled heavily and rubbed the back of his neck. Things have been stressful lately. I nodded once, but said nothing. For the first time in years, I refused to rescue him from uncomfortable silence. He glanced around the kitchen awkwardly before speaking again. Emma misses you. I continued unpacking groceries calmly. I miss her too. Another silence stretched between us. Then finally, Daniel lowered his voice. Ashley is overwhelmed right now. There it was again. Everything somehow returned to Ashley. Her feelings, her stress, her version of reality. I placed a carton of eggs carefully inside the refrigerator before turning to face him fully. Did you come here to apologize to me, Daniel? His eyes shifted away immediately. Mom, it was a misunderstanding. I stared at him in disbelief. A misunderstanding? Ashley just felt disrespected that night, he replied defensively. You showing up unexpectedly embarrassed her. For several seconds, I honestly wondered whether he could hear himself anymore. Your daughter invited me, I said quietly. And your wife threw food onto the floor while calling me names in front of strangers. Daniel sighed impatiently, like an exhausted manager dealing with an unreasonable employee. You always focus on the delivery instead of the bigger issue. Something inside me turned completely still then. Not angry, not emotional, just still. Because I finally understood that Daniel was no longer trying to determine right from wrong. He was trying to protect the version of his life that felt easiest for him to maintain. Then his eyes landed on the stack of paperwork sitting on my dining room table. What is all this? He asked casually. Financial records, I answered. I have been organizing things. His expression changed slightly. Why? I folded my hands together calmly. Because I realized something recently. I have spent years making your life easier while being treated like an intrusion inside it. Daniel looked uncomfortable now. Nobody said you are an intrusion. I held his gaze steadily. Ashley did. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped because we both knew it was true. A heavy silence filled the room. Finally, Daniel stepped closer and lowered his voice carefully. Look, things have just gotten expensive lately. Emma's school tuition increased. The house repairs cost more than expected. Ashley has been under pressure. There was at last the real reason for the visit. Not guilt, not reconciliation. Concern. Concern that the support they quietly depended on might disappear. I walked slowly toward the cabinet beside the sink and removed the small envelope containing the spare key to my house. I placed it gently onto the counter between us. Daniel stared down at it in confusion. What is this? Your key, I replied softly. I think it is time we all respected each other's boundaries. His face shifted instantly. Not sadness, alarm. Because for the first time since that night at the restaurant, my son realized I was no longer standing in front of him begging to remain part of his life. The following Saturday morning arrived with an unusual kind of stillness in my home. The air felt lighter, almost unfamiliar, like a room that had been rearranged while I was asleep. I made tea slowly, watching the steam rise from the cup, and realized I was no longer waiting for my phone to ring. That realization alone felt like a quiet kind of freedom. Around mid-morning, I drove to the bank. It was not a decision made in anger, but in clarity. The branch manager greeted me politely as always and led me into a small office with glass walls and soft lighting. I placed my folder of financial documents on the table and asked to review every account tied to my name. As the numbers appeared on the screen, I felt something shift inside me. For years, I had treated my finances as something shared, something fluid between family members. But sitting there in that quiet office, I saw it differently. These were not shared resources. They were responsibilities I had carried alone while others benefited quietly in the background. The manager explained everything carefully, including several recurring transfers I had set up years ago that I had completely forgotten about. One was labeled simply as family support. Another was an automatic payment toward Daniel's mortgage account. I stared at those words on the screen for a long time without speaking. The manager asked if I wanted to make any changes. For the first time, I did not hesitate. I requested that all discretionary transfers be paused immediately and that any shared access permissions be removed. My voice did not shake when I said it, which surprised me more than anything else. When I left the bank, the sunlight outside felt sharper than usual, as if the world itself had become more defined. That afternoon, I received a phone call from Daniel. I let it ring 3 times before answering. His voice came through immediately, tense and controlled. "Mom, the bank just notified us about changes to the mortgage payment setup. Did you do something?" I walked slowly toward my kitchen window and looked out at my backyard. "Yes," I said calmly. There was a pause on the line. "Why would you do that without talking to us first?" he asked. I exhaled gently. "I have been talking for years, Daniel. I do not think you were listening." His tone shifted quickly now, less controlled. "This is going to create problems for us." I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but recognition. "Then you will solve them," I replied quietly. Another silence followed. I could hear faint background noise, likely Ashley nearby. I could almost picture her standing just out of frame, listening closely. Daniel lowered his voice. "Mom, this is not just about money. This affects Emma's stability." That sentence used to break me instantly in the past. But something had changed. I sat down at my kitchen table and spoke with steady calm. "Emma will always be supported. But I will no longer be the invisible foundation of a household that no longer respects me." The words felt final as they left my mouth. Daniel did not respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "Ashley is going to be very upset." I almost smiled at that. "She already is," I said. "I am simply no longer managing the consequences of it." The call ended shortly after that without resolution. I placed the phone face down on the table and sat in silence. For the first time in a long time, that silence did not feel heavy. It felt like space. And in that space, I began to understand something important. I had not taken anything away from them. I had simply stopped giving away pieces of myself that I could no longer afford to lose. The morning of the event arrived without any announcement, as if the world had decided to continue moving forward regardless of everything that had happened. I woke early, as I always did, and sat by my bedroom window watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. There were children waiting for school buses, joggers moving along the sidewalk, and neighbors watering their lawns as if nothing in life ever truly changed. But I knew something had changed, not in the world outside, but in me. That afternoon, I received a formal invitation in the mail. It was printed on thick ivory paper with elegant gold lettering. A community charity gala hosted at the same Italian restaurant where everything had fallen apart. I almost laughed when I read it. Life had a strange sense of timing. The event was scheduled for Friday evening, and according to the guest list, several familiar names were included. Daniel Whitmore, Ashley Carter, and, unexpectedly, my name as well. I had not been asked directly, which told me everything I needed to know about how my presence was being interpreted. I was not being invited as family. I was being included as a formality. I placed the invitation on my kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time. For a moment, I considered ignoring it entirely. But another thought came quietly afterward. Sometimes silence allows people to rewrite history, and I was no longer willing to let that happen. Friday evening arrived with a cool, steady breeze. I chose my outfit carefully, not for attention, but for composure. A simple navy dress, modest jewelry, and a small silver bracelet that Robert had given me. Many years ago, when I arrived at the restaurant, I noticed immediately that the atmosphere had changed since that night. Soft lighting replaced the harsh memory of humiliation. Tables were arranged neatly, and guests moved through the space with polite conversation and practiced smiles. I stood near the entrance for a moment before stepping inside. Several heads turned briefly, but no one reacted dramatically. I was not invisible, but I was also not yet acknowledged. That changed when I saw Daniel across the room. He looked up almost immediately, his expression tightening with surprise. Ashley was beside him, speaking to another couple, but the moment she noticed his reaction, her eyes followed his line of sight. The instant she saw me, her smile faded. Not completely, but enough for me to notice. I did not approach them right away. Instead, I accepted a glass of water from a passing server and moved calmly toward the seating area reserved for honored guests. There was a name card placed at each seat. Mine was already there, positioned directly across from Daniel and Ashley. As I sat down, I noticed something subtle but important. People were watching, not in a hostile way this time, but with curiosity, awareness. The narrative was no longer controlled in private conversations or behind closed doors. It was now shared in a public space where perception mattered differently. Ashley leaned toward Daniel and whispered something quickly, her posture tense. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at me for a long moment across the table. It was the first time in weeks that he had looked at me without distraction, without interruption, just silence and recognition. I returned his gaze calmly, not with anger, not with expectation, simply with presence. A few seconds later, the host approached the microphone to begin the evening program. The room quieted gradually as attention shifted forward. But I remained still, understanding something that had taken me a long time to learn. I was no longer waiting to be included. I was already present, and that alone changed everything.